Hi, thanks for joining me again. Today I'm going to work through with you how to make an applique pincushion. Now this applique uses a Hugs and Kisses applique paper, which in my opinion gives me the look of needle turn applique, and it certainly has saved me an enormous lot of stress because I quickly gave up on needle turn applique. But when I found this, I thought this was absolutely fantastic. So if we have a look at our applique paper, you'll notice that it's got two different sides. First side then is a flat or a matte side. The other side is a shiny side. The shiny side is the fusible side. So when we go to put it onto our fabric later on, we just need to make sure that it's the shiny side that we've got facing down to the fabric. The other thing that we need to be aware of, and if you have a look at your pattern, it will give you clear instructions, but what we need to be aware of is that in order to have our finished product facing the same direction, as in this case, both the finished product faces the same direction as the pattern, we need to trace onto the shiny side of the paper. Otherwise, what you'll find is that your finished applique will be facing in the opposite direction. So the other thing then to bear in mind with the paper is that we don't need to add a seam allowance to the shapes when we trace them out. So the only thing that we need to make sure is that we can actually cut between those shapes. Having a look at the pattern then, you'll notice that there are some little dotted lines on these pieces here. And that just means that they're going to tuck in underneath that circle. So we'll trace them out, but we'll keep that in mind for a bit later on. The other thing that we need to do is cut each of these petals separate, or trace each of the petals separately to the circles. So we'll have the circle in a different position, and then this circle will be separate again on our paper that we traced. Corner. Now the other thing to bear in mind when you're tracing is that the line that you're going to trace will be the line that your fabric will fold over. So it is important then to try and get those lines as straight as you possibly can, because your fabric will fold over those lines. Now, just another little thing that I find handy to do is, if I come back later on, it's easier if I've just numbered those petals, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And after I've traced my petals, I will, onto my applique paper, I'll put the same numbers on them. And it just helps later on when we're gluing them sticking them onto our fabric. It's easier to tell which one is which. So I'll just go ahead now and trace each of those shapes, and then we'll have a look at it when I've got them all on there. Okay, so I've got all of those shapes traced now onto my piece of applique paper, onto the shiny side, and you'll notice then that I've got all of my petals, a large circle, 2 leaves, and with a small circle, which is in the middle of the flower there, I've got 2 copies of that, and the reason for that is that we will join them together, and it will just give us a little thicker edge, which will come in handy a bit later on. And the other thing that you'll notice then is that of that little piece of applique paper, I've still got all this section still free, and I'll pop that away and use that for another project later on. So the next step then, what we're going to be doing then is cutting out each of our shapes. And when we go around the corners, if you turn the paper around the scissors, you'll find that you'll get a much smoother curve. So try and do that as much as you possibly can, rather than moving your scissors, and just put it to one side. And we'll do that with each of our shapes. So just bearing in mind once again that the lines that we've traced then are the lines that the fabric will be folded over, so we need to keep them as straight and smooth as possible. So once you've chosen then the piece that you're going to use for the main petals, we're going to take our petals that we've traced out, and we're going to position them onto our fabric. Now this is where you need to consider, I'll just move that up so you can see it properly. This is where you need to consider that you're going to need to leave 1/4 inch seam allowance around each piece. So don't have them too close together. And as I said, you've got a whole strip to use, so you've got plenty of fabric to use. And you might like to think about fussy cutting. Options are open to you depending on what fabric you've got to use. But you just need to make sure when you position them on your fabric that you've left yourself plenty of room to cut 1/4 inch around each piece. So if we had them side by side, we'd want to make sure each one had 1/4 inch, and we'd move it so there was 1/2 inch between them. So just position them then. Now making sure that again that shiny side of your paper is facing down against your fabric. It's not going to be a huge disaster if it's not, because it will peel off the iron relatively easily, I'm here to tell you. But best if we can avoid that to start with by making sure that shiny side is down on the fabric. Now, it would be easier if you were to position that on your ironing board or your ironing table, so then you don't have to pick it up and move it, which is what I'm going to do now. So I'll just go and press that down with the iron. It just needs a short press just to make sure it's attached. Use a dry iron because the glue is water soluble in the fusible. We don't want to start that dissolving process just yet. So we'll make sure we just use a dry iron. So I've got those pieces all fused onto the fabric now with a nice bit of space between them. I'm going to start cutting them out, and I'll just allow roughly 1/4 inch seam allowance, so 1/4 inch extra around each of the shapes. What you'll find when you start to gather the fabric over your paper is that particularly on these curved areas, 1/4 inch might be a little bit too big. Just make sure you've got a decent seam allowance there, and bear in mind that because if you come back to the pattern, you'll remember that these petals tuck in underneath. You won't need to leave 1/4 inch beyond the bottom of each petal, but just a tiny bit there, because we're not going to have to fold that over. When if you have a look at this petal, you'll see that it's got a curve on it. We'll just clip in there, and we will be very careful where we've clipped. So we're not going right up to the paper, but when we go to press it down, you'll see there that it's just that little clip that I've put in there will help to keep that curved shape. So if you have got some curves like that, just give them a gentle clip, but don't go right up to the paper, just a couple of threads before. So we're done to the cut all those petals out, and we'll just clip this one, which was the second one. Just clip him in as leaves. When you go to do your small circle, just remember how I cut 2 of those small circles out. What we'll do is put one down, and then we'll put the other one on top of it, and we'll fuse them together onto our fabric, so that when we cut around it, what it does is just gives us a thicker piece to wrap our fabric over, and that will be quite handy. So let's go ahead then and fuse our other applique paper to our other fabrics, and then we'll come back ready for the next step. So I've got all my pieces cut out now, the paper's fused to the fabric, and they've all been cut out, remembering 1/4 inch seam allowance around them. When you get to this little one, we've got the double layer of applique paper on there, and I have trimmed it back a bit less than 1/4 inch, and you'll possibly only 1/8, but you'll find that as you're gathering it around in a circle, the shorter seam allowance will help to make that a lot easier. So what we're going to do then is start with our leaves, and not our leaves, our petals, and using the Sue Daly glue stick, same glue stick that I use for English paper piecing. You can use the same thing for applique, so it gets lots of use. Don't forget that they come in a packet with a refill, and you can just get refills to go with them. And I can just still see the numbers on my petals there, so I'll start with number 1. And what we're going to do is just use a small amount of glue. A couple of things to keep in mind. Don't glue right up to the paper, because when you turn your fabric over and we stick it onto the background, we're going to be stitching on that edge. So it's best if we can avoid putting glue on there. The other thing, and the good thing about your glue stick that's designed for this purpose, is that it's only got a small head, and you can just very minimally apply your glue. And if you are close enough to the edge without being right on the edge, you will actually turn your fabric over. Let's see how well we can do that. Turn your fabric over with your finger, and you should be able to manage, and sometimes it'll take a bit of practice, but you may be able to manage being able to turn your fabric over without getting glue on your fingers. But I think this was number 5, just to show you how, just exactly the same. So I'm just gluing a little bit at a time and gently gathering as we go. Around the curves. And we've got most of our shapes glued over now with our glue pen. We'll just come back to the leaves though, because you'll notice I've done that one and it's got a little tail that didn't quite tuck under. So I'll just do that one, the other one again, so you can see what actually happens there. We'll start down on this side and we'll press him over in the same way as we've done the other pieces, folding the fabric over the edge. And what you'll notice is that because it's on a sharper angle, or that point of the bottom end of the leaf, because it's a sharper angle than certainly the other pieces, it won't fold completely, the fabric won't fold completely over the paper, and so we end up having a little tail, and just getting that together nice and smoothly around the point there. So that's not to be concerned about. Don't try and force it, because at the end, when we start stitching them onto our background fabric, what we'll do is we will tuck that little tail up underneath. So we'll just get it into a nice position there so it's folded over. Once again, making sure that we're happy with the curves or the shape of our leaves. And once again, I've got that little tail that will need to be tucked in underneath when we're stitching it on. So the next step then is to collect our background fabric and give it a press if it needs a press after it's been folded in the bag. It's possible that it will. And it might be easier for you to do this step over on the ironing board once again, so you don't have to move it. You will have use your pattern as your guide and position your fabric, making sure that you've got enough room for a 1/4 inch seam allowance to be at the top, and it's not going to cut into your flower. I can just see my flower pattern underneath this, but if you're having trouble, you can always pull it back and see where your flower will go. And if I have a look on this side, I can see a leaf just there, so I might just move it over a little bit so it's a bit more in the center. Plenty of room on this side. And once I'm happy with that, then we need to go ahead and start attaching our petals to our background fabric. So if you remember earlier on, I numbered my petals and I numbered my pattern, and that's where that makes this job much easier. So this one was number 4, which will come down here. Number 2. This one here. They are all different shapes, but sometimes it's just a little bit easier, I find, to position them if I know where they're meant to be. Making sure then that you're happy, and remember that they had the lines on the pattern where those petals are just going to go in underneath the circle. So we'll just position them where they need to be. So once you've got your petals and any of your other pieces lined up in the position that you're happy with, we're just going to add a little bit of the Roxanne's glue paste. We'll just have a few dots once again with your glue, avoiding the edges of the piece because we'll be gluing there, and then we'll just reposition where we're happy with them. We'll continue on in that way until we've got them. And I just would do, so with these 2 pieces, rather than stitching that one on and then this one through all 3 layers, we're going to pop this one onto the little one onto the big one first. So just position that in a way that looks like the pattern, and once again just a couple of little dots of glue, certainly doesn't need a lot, and we'll pop him on there separately. Now when you're putting your glue on your petals, we're again just going around the outside edge, and please avoid the area where those tails are, because we're going to stitch them down later on and we'll need to be able to stick them underneath the piece. So if we've got glue, we've got too much glue around that area, it's going to make that job pretty difficult. So we'll just avoid the tail for now and just position them as we need to. According to our pattern. So at this point then, that glue will dry all by itself if you've got something better to do for 15 minutes. If you're in a hurry and would like to continue on though, just give that a press with your iron and that will help to dry it. So I'll do that now. The nice thing about the Roxanne's glue is that if you're not happy with where you position something, you can pick it up and move it again. And when I got over to the ironing board, I repositioned my leaves a little bit because when I looked back at the pattern, I could see that the stem comes from the base of this leaf and needs to run down through the center there. So I had to move one of my leaves over a little bit. So I've attached my petals, my flower petals, my leaves, and I've put these 2 pieces together because I'm going to stitch them separately, and then I will attach them to the center of the flower like that. Now what you will have also received in your kit is an applique needle. It's a Hugs and Kisses applique needle, and you've received a sample of 80 weight thread, which is a wonderful thread, which is the thread that I use for both applique and English paper piecing. And as you know, I've said many times, if you've heard me say this, I'll say it again, that if you'd like your stitches to be as invisible as possible or as least visible as possible, the key, as I see it, is to have thread that's as fine as possible and as strong as possible, obviously, to hold your pieces, and it will disappear into your fabric. So I've endeavoured to give you some thread that I thought would blend well with the fabrics that are in your kit, but I usually would normally just use a neutral thread, something that blends well. So I'm going to pick up these 2 pieces to start with so that I can show you just how I do this applique stitch. So if you bear in mind that there is a side, obviously, to that piece there, we're going to put our needle up through the bottom of the main piece, the backing piece, and we're just going to grab a hold of the side of the top piece. And what we're aiming for is to go straight back down in basically the same area. You certainly won't be going in the same hole because it wouldn't attach it if you went in the same hole, but you're just looking to do a vertical stitch up and down, and then we're going to move along just a tiny bit, maybe 1/8 of an inch, and we're going to do the same thing. So we're just grabbing the side of our applique shape, going up and then back down into the bottom piece. I'll try and hold this a little bit closer to the camera so you can see. Just coming up through the side of your shape. And back down in the same place. So really just hooking onto the side of your applique shape to secure it, and then back down. We're still at the showgrounds, the Adelaide showgrounds at the moment. We've been here for almost a couple of weeks. We're here for Craft Alive last weekend, and while we've been sitting here, they've been setting up for another festival this weekend, and it sounds like they're doing some sound checks for music. So that you're hearing some background noise, that's what it is. So I'm just continuing to go around there, just grabbing the side of my shape and remembering to do a vertical stitch straight back down in the same area. So what you'll find is that all the travelling that you've been doing with your needle and thread is on the back of the piece, where it's going to be well hidden. We've finished off that centre piece, and now I've glue basted that whole piece over the top of the petals. So you'll see there how the petals, end of the petals, slide in underneath it. We'll go on then and stitch down these leaves, so I can show you then how we just tuck those points in underneath. One of the good things about the Roxanne's glue based, as I mentioned, is that it's not permanent. It will it is easy to just pick up your shapes and remove them, and but as a result, of course, and the fact that it's water soluble, we do still need to stitch our pieces down. We can't just leave them like that and hope for the best, because eventually they will just drop off. So again, I'm just continuing to come up, hook into the side there and go straight back down. And then running along the back, coming back up into the side of our applique piece, just taking a little stitch and going back down the side. And as I mentioned earlier, the fact that it's such a fine thread means that those threads will just disappear into your fabric. So you'll remember that we had a little tail on our leaf. This point then, we're just going to tuck that tail under the end of our leaf, and just use my fingernail to do that, and make sure it's tucked nice and tidily out of the way as I get up to stitching around that point. You certainly shouldn't be thinking to cut anything off, because if you do, that's when it's likely to pop out and fray. So we just need to tuck it under nice and neatly, keeping to as much of that point as you possibly can. And as you stitch around the corner, then what you're going to do is put a little stitch right on that point. So right on that very point where you've tucked everything under, holding it down, tucking any loose bits out of the way, and just go around the corner. So even, so you've got a good couple of stitches around that corner, but certainly one on the point to tuck everything out of the way. And we just continue around that edge and continue to sew our leaf on. So I've got both of those leaves attached now. It's just really a case of having them nice and where you've tucked the pieces in underneath, making sure you've got some but maybe even an extra couple of stitches around this point, so certainly on the side and at the end and underneath, so that where you've tucked that tail in underneath it, they're not going to be able to sneak out on you, because those stitches have got them nicely enclosed. So we'll go back to the main piece then. I just wanted to get those leaves done to show you how to handle that tail. And so it's exactly the same stitch then with the rest of it, and we'll once again put a little quilter's knot in our thread and coming up from underneath and out there what I'm going. So you'll notice I'm putting my needle back down under my backing fabric, and I'm just running it along underneath the background fabric, bringing it up into my applique shape and then straight back down again. So I will just continue to do that to get the rest of this applique piece on. And I'd like to invite you at this point then to come back and join me in the second part of this session, when I've got all of this applique shape onto the background fabric, and I will work with you to show you how I do my embroidery around the shape and put the pieces all together. I hope that you've enjoyed that, and if you've got the kit, that you'll be able to get started making your applique pincushion. We'll see you in the next session.